So this morning I'm going to talk about Samskara, the fourth in the list of the five Skandhas. And as you can see, the wind has finally dropped enough for me to come down here to the loch shore. We finally, after a week of wind, we have still waters. Still no rain though, perhaps a little unusually for Dharma. So samskaras, or sankara in Sanskrit, is usually translated as formations. Sometimes it's translated as volition or volitional formations or mental formations. So in the modern world, in the modern West particularly, we have a very sophisticated psychological way of thinking about mind and experience and relationships and such like. This is sort of developed in the last 100 years or so, and as Buddhists is very, very useful. It has sometimes led to an interpretation of samskara which is too weighted towards the psychological, and you will find that sometimes there's a critique of an overly psychological interpretation of samskara. But I think this idea of a sort of facet that draws together our experience, that has a sort of formative aspect to it, experiences drawn together, and it has a kind of momentum, a kind of direction. When we investigate experience through the Skandhas, investigate ourselves through the Skandhas, and ourselves, as I said in the very first of these talks on Rupa, we can't really separate ourselves from our world when we're looking at experience. When we look at our experience, or ourselves in that way, we start to see these formative processes, the way we see the world and think about the world being constructed from different aspects of experience. So when investigating samskara, we can be aware of how our experience is drawn out of this totality. The form, the rupa, the associated vedana, the process of differentiation and recognition forms a sense of our world, and that has direction. It has movement. One of the basic teachings in Buddhism, of course, is that of impermanence, that nothing is fixed, nothing is in itself substantial. And this forming process is, as I was saying when I was talking about samnya yesterday, we can extend that idea of samnya resolving objects into a sort of formative momentum of experience that we would talk about as being our mental states. And in that momentum, we're not passive to that momentum. We're creating that. We're doing something with it. We're directing it, often because of the associated vedana. But also we feel that push. We feel that push to move in certain directions in our mind, whether that's to think about things in a certain way or whether it's to do things. So samskara can be experienced either as a directional movement of the mind or as a desire to move, the mind's desire to move in a particular direction. Or perhaps at another level, just in the desire to move. When you're sitting meditating and you realise that actually you'd rather like a cup of tea, or maybe you need a pee. It's quite biological and straightforward. So we can become more aware of the movements of the mind, more aware of how our minds are directing, or being directed, if you like. And we can become more aware of our desire to move, our desire to act or to think about things in certain ways. And in becoming more aware of those processes, those momentums, we may well start to find patterns. We may well start to find patterns of behaviour or ways of thinking. And by linking that up, by recognising that the samskara element of our experience, this sort of formative process element of our experience, is also being conditioned by the other aspects of the five skandhas, we can start to see how, particularly how Vedana affects the movements of the mind and the arising of volition. We can see how the processes of samnya, the thing-making aspect of mind, and just how the actual base experience all start to influence, to come together, to give us a sense of agency and a sense of entity even in our world. Our volitional processes, for most people, this particular aspect of the five skandhas is often the one that we identify with the most strongly. So one of the difficulties, of course, is that quite often our volitional process, because they are quite strongly conditioned, are also quite persistent. So yes, it passes one day and then, whoops, there we go again, we're back in the same old mindsets, the same old sort of psychological pattern is reasserting itself. So it's quite important to remember when working in this kind of area that, well, samskaras run deep, don't they? They run at the very core of what drives our lives. From a Buddhist perspective, of course, the Buddhist view of our being is one of past lives. It's one of actions that are outside of our capacity to remember, also having influenced the way we are, having influenced our samskaras, having influenced the basic volitional forces of our life. So part of the paradigm of Buddhism helps us understand that there may well, or while there may well be elements of our life that we can engage with and understand psychologically, there may also just be some very deep currents of being that are not so amenable to that kind of analysis. But we can still be aware of those currents, be aware of those forces, and develop a looser, kind of more open aspect to them that sees and understands how they're conditioned and supported by elements of our experience. These days we talk quite a lot about people being triggered. We talk about it in quite a specific kind of a way, often a strong emotional experience being triggered by a particular event that mirrors something in the past. The same kind of idea probably actually applies to a very, very wide range of the way our minds move and the way we relate to the world and the way we conceive who and what we are. I come to a place like this that I've been to lots before on a beautiful morning, and I just want to jump in the water. That's kind of what I do down here. So I'm sort of being influenced by this sense of a calm, still, beautiful morning, and yeah, I know there's some snow on the hill and therefore it's going to be cold, but it's going to be exhilarating too, I think.